Welcome to the debate. Today, we are grappling with one of the most compelling and, let's be honest, frustrating criminal enigmas in American history, the Zodiac Killer. This figure, active in the late 60s and early 70s, wasn't just a murderer. He was, arguably, the first true modern master of media manipulation. He actively orchestrated his own publicity campaign, weaponizing letters, threats, and that chilling crosshair symbol to hold the entire Bay Area and the press hostage.
Right, and that media campaign is precisely why this case endures. The Zodiac understood that in the modern era, control wasn't just about terrorizing victims, it was about terrifying the masses through communication. But what really set his campaign apart were the complex cryptograms he sent alongside his taunting letters. These ciphers were presented as the key to the entire mystery, promising to reveal the one thing everyone sought, his identity.
And that promise, or perhaps that threat, brings us directly to our central question today. Were the Zodiac's complex ciphers primarily genuine, albeit, twisted, attempts to reveal his identity and secure that permanent, named recognition? Or were they fundamentally tools of mockery and psychological warfare, meticulously designed to exert control and just perpetually frustrate the authorities?
I come at this from a different angle. I'm going to argue that the objective evidence, the evidence we've derived from the two ciphers we've actually solved, demonstrates overwhelmingly that their purpose was pure psychological torment and control. It proves them to be nothing more than exceptionally sophisticated mind games.
And I will be presenting the counterposition that the sheer effort and, crucially, the specific framing surrounding these ciphers, particularly the Unsolved Z13, point to a profound narcissistic need. This was a killer who saw himself as an intellectual superior, and only his name, encoded as the ultimate puzzle, could grant him the intellectual recognition that he so clearly craved. So my thesis really centers on the psychology of the Zodiac himself, who many profilers suggest suffered from an extreme form of malignant narcissism. He invested an extraordinary amount of effort into these cryptograms, far more than was necessary simply to prove he was intelligent. This complexity, coupled with the consistent promise of identity across his communications, suggests they were intended as his ultimate, albeit delayed and twisted, confession.
Okay, but a confession that never actually arrived. If the core motivation was a need for named recognition, why go to such lengths to bury the name inside puzzles that, when solved, only delivered empty philosophy and taunts? The evidence from the two solved ciphers, the Z408 and the Z340, it forces us to conclude that the cryptograms were extensions of his terror campaign, designed for maximum psychological impact, demanding attention while ensuring those trying to catch him remained perpetually frustrated.
I think you're prematurely dismissing the evidence of intent based only on the initial results. We have to look at the hierarchy of his communication. The Z13 is the one piece that, for me, breaks your argument about pure mockery. It is explicitly prefaced by the phrase, "my name is," followed immediately by those 13 cryptic symbols. That framing, that direct linguistic contract, elevates it beyond the rambling manifestos of the others.
That promise of identity, especially in the context of a known deceiver and manipulator, was the ultimate trap. Think about the effect. The Zodiac offered a seemingly solvable puzzle that, if cracked, would reveal everything. But the results of the long ciphers proved that the real goal was to lead investigators to avoid. By offering the Z13, the Zodiac didn't promise resolution. He guaranteed perpetual obsession. Let's talk specifics. We have objective proof of what happens when these codes are broken. The Z408 was solved pretty quickly, back in 1969. And what did it yield? A bizarre, self-aggrandizing philosophical statement about collecting slaves for the afterlife. A statement that, it reveals his warped worldview, but absolutely nothing about who he was.
I concede that point. The Z408 was not a revelation of identity, but it was essential in establishing his philosophical groundwork. He needed the world to understand why he killed before he revealed who he was.
And what about the Z340? This one is critical. It resisted solution for 51 years. The challenge was immense, partially because of the unconventional diagonal reading pattern he used, a pattern that just defied traditional cryptographic expectation. If his goal was to confess, why use a complex grid cipher that deliberately obfuscated the message through such an unpredictable key?
That's an interesting point about the reading pattern, though I would frame it differently. The difficulty of the Z340 is proof of the intellectual effort he invested. He didn't just want to be caught. He wanted to be acknowledged as a cryptographic genius. That intellectual investment was necessary to set the stage for the true prize. The longer ciphers were the demonstration of skill. The Z13 was the signature.
But that reasoning implies a structured unveiling, and the content of the Z340 itself utterly contradicts that idea. Once it was solved after 5 decades of intense effort, the message was just a direct, juvenile taunt aimed squarely at the authorities. I hope you are having lots of fun in trying to catch me. I am not afraid of the gas chamber because it will send me to paradise all the sooner. That is pure, unadulterated psychological warfare. It's designed to provoke, to humiliate, and to control the investigation. It serves no purpose related to self-revelation.
I see the immediate frustration in that result. However, I believe that the mockery was essential to his narcissistic framework. The Z340 proves he could baffle the FBI and NSA, validating his superiority. But the lack of a name in the long manifestos simply shows he was saving the ultimate information for the shortest, most condensed, and therefore most challenging puzzle. The Z13. It's an escalation. First the philosophy, second the taunt, finally the identity.
Okay, but let's press on the Z13 itself, because this is where the cryptographic analysis really undercuts the idea of a genuine confession. You rely heavily on the phrase, "my name is," being a contractual agreement, but that's a verbal promise from a proven liar. The real issue is the structure. The Z13 has only 13 characters.
Precisely. It's the highest degree of difficulty.
It's the highest degree of statistical implausibility. Cryptographers have pointed out that an alphabet of 26 letters, and the Zodiac used a symbol set with more than just letters, means that a 13-character message is mathematically too short to be uniquely solved without knowing the exact key or pattern. And the Zodiac never provided that. Any attempt at brute forcing 13 characters just yields too many plausible short words.
That's a compelling argument regarding the statistical limitation, and it certainly supports the idea that the Z13 was designed to frustrate. But have you considered the possibility that the Zodiac knew the statistical limitations and viewed the Z13 as a final, maybe even desperate attempt to ensure his name was discoverable, even if highly improbable, as he realized the game was ending?
I think that attributes too much accidental vulnerability to him. The Zodiac was highly skilled. If he wanted his name known, if he needed that recognition, he had a dozen ways to do it clearly. He could have written his name backward in a letter, or even signed the Z340. Instead, he presented a cipher that he very likely knew was virtually unsolvable. Therefore, the Z13 becomes the ultimate act of control, the promise of the Holy Grail that can never truly be found.
I would argue, though, that his need for recognition superseded the need for resolution. He needed to be permanently enshrined in the history books, and the Z13, even if it remained unsolved, ensured that generations of code breakers would obsess over his ghost. He differentiated himself from common criminals by offering an intellectual challenge that defined his genius. The Z13 is the artifact he left behind to ensure his permanent, elevated status.
But if the goal was genius-level identification, why did he mix the highly intricate code work with such blatant, almost sloppy, circumstantial clues pointing directly toward a suspect? This is the core contradiction I find hard to reconcile with your theory of the intellectual narcissist saving his identity for a coded challenge.
That's an interesting point. Which circumstantial evidence are you referring to specifically?
Well, what we're talking about the evidence pointing toward Arthur Leigh Allen. If the ciphers were the true path to his identity, why did he use overwhelming non-coded clues? We know that Allen lived in Vallejo, which was the epicenter of the early crimes. He was allegedly wearing a Zodiac brand watch, a specific, obscure item featuring the exact crosshair symbol the killer used. He also owned the type of wingwalker boots found at one of the crime scenes.
You are describing physical, tangible clues that law enforcement could use to build a case in the real world. I agree, those are compelling facts. But the purpose of that circumstantial trail was, I think, different.
Different how? It seems to me he was perfectly willing to leave massive, traceable clues, the physical evidence of who he was, while reserving the coded letters for abstract psychological control and fear. If he was so concerned with his name being associated with cryptographic genius, why risk exposure through physical items that were easy to link to him?
Because he was playing two separate games for two separate audiences. The circumstantial evidence, the boots, the alleged pre-crime talk, the watch, that was the game for the police. That was the element designed to create immediate, sustained suspicion and terror in his immediate geographic sphere.
And the letters?
I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning. If the coded world held the ultimate truth, it failed spectacularly, delivering only mockery. The physical clues, while frustratingly non-definitive, are far more substantive in building a profile. Consider the timing. He started the communications after the initial murders. The letters were a reaction, an attempt to redirect and control the investigation. But that control manifests in different ways. In the early stages, yes, the letters demanded media coverage and taunted the police. But as the investigation lagged, the ciphers became his main weapon. The Z340, for example, took decades to solve. That duration itself is the ultimate act of control. It proved he could sustain the game for half a century without revealing himself, guaranteeing his place in the public consciousness.
And that's precisely the sticking point for me. Sustained attention and control is the function of the unsolved cipher, not the promise of the cipher. The Z13, being statistically unsolvable, is the perfect mechanism for eternal control. It doesn't matter what it says. What matters is the eternal inability to confirm what it says.
Yet, if the Z13 were meant to be eternally frustrating, why include the definite article, "My name is"? Why not just 13 random symbols? The inclusion of that sentence sets a goal. It may have been a highly complex transposition cipher that relied on a key from a previous letter, a key we've simply missed. To assert that he knew it was absolutely unsolvable risks simplifying his own psychology. He might have seen the Z13 as the ultimate challenge, a test for humanity itself, knowing that if it were ever solved, his identity would be linked to the greatest cryptographic feat in criminal history.
I think the inclusion of "my name is" exactly what makes it such brilliant psychological manipulation. It guarantees that the public will prioritize the Z13, investing maximum mental energy into a puzzle with the highest probability of failure. The Zodiac wasn't just interested in confusing police. He was interested in exhausting the intellectual resources of the entire cryptographic community.
I think we can agree that the ciphers functioned as psychological weapons, but I maintain they had a dual purpose: control through terror and eventual recognition through intellectual conquest. The Z13 represents the apex of the latter. His desire for fame, for credit, for his name to be permanently etched next to his crosshairs logo required a final named signature.
But the two solved ciphers provide zero textual precedent for that expectation. The contents prove the ciphers were primarily self-serving vehicles for boosting his ego and tormenting his pursuers. Why should the shortest, most ambiguous cipher be treated as the sincere exception to a pattern of pure mockery? The function of the codes was control and frustration, not revelation.
Was not just to terrify, but to achieve a permanent, named legacy through an intellectual feat. He needed that final card to play, ensuring that even after his last letter in 1974, the puzzle promising the ultimate truth remained. The solved codes were merely the psychological groundwork designed to generate enough media frenzy to make the eventual name revelation matter.
Ultimately, the actual yield of the two ciphers we conquered, pure philosophical rambling and overt mockery, demonstrates that the fundamental function of the codes was control and frustration. The Z13 is likely just the most effective, unresolvable element of his psychological arsenal, ensuring the debate over his identity and his true intent remains eternal.
Perhaps the truth lies uncomfortably between our two positions. A murderer so driven by narcissistic recognition that he created a puzzle that guaranteed his eternal fame, even if that puzzle remained perpetually locked.
It leaves us with the enduring mystery of the monster who created a logo and simply walked away, ensuring that the exploration of his intent will continue as long as the Z13 remains unsolved.